Okay, let's unpack this with a thought experiment.
Sure.
I want you to imagine living in an era where literally everything around you is fundamentally changing.
Right.
And I don't mean the superficial changes we're used to today, like, a new smartphone drops or some social media platform falls out of favor.
Yeah, the stuff we barely notice.
Exactly. I am talking about the bedrock of your reality. The way you earn a living is transforming. The way you move across the physical landscape is altering. Deeply held religious convictions, the kind that literally defined your ancestors for centuries, they're suddenly up for debate.
Right, the foundational stuff.
Yeah. Even the vocabulary you use to speak to your neighbors is subtly shifting into something entirely new. But the catch is, it's happening so gradually in your day-to-day routine that you barely perceive the ground shifting beneath your feet.
You're just living your life.
You just wake up one morning, look around, and realize the world your parents inhabited has completely vanished.
It's the classic boiling frog scenario.
Yeah.
But applied to an entire civilization.
Right.
You're swimming in the water, the temperature's steadily rising, and because you're so focused on the minutiae of your daily life, you fail to notice the fundamental state of your environment is altering, at least until the old landscape is completely unrecognizable.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a massive stack of notes and historical analysis drawn directly from Chapter 18 of G.M. Trevelyan's English Social History.
It's a dense one.
It really is. We are locking our focus on the second half of the Victorian era, specifically the years spanning roughly from 1865 to 1901. Our mission today is to understand how England made this incredibly complex transition from a rigid, aristocratic, horse-drawn society into an anxious, motorized, bureaucratic, and democratic modern world.
And what's really fascinating here is how historically elusive this specific era is to define.
How so?
Well, when you study political history, you have the comfort of hard boundaries. A war begins on a specific Tuesday, a monarch is crowned on a Thursday.
Treaty assigned.
Yeah. Exactly. Social history, which is the intricate tapestry of how everyday people lived, how they reasoned, how they interacted, it defies that kind of neat categorization.
Because it's messy.
It's incredibly messy. Social customs are in a state of perpetual motion, but they rarely change entirely all at once.
So the old essentially overlaps the new. You have the past and the future sitting in the exact same parlor.
Precisely. The overlap is so profound that historians constantly debate whether a particular cultural tendency or a certain philosophical framework belongs to the outgoing generation or the incoming one.
Right.
In this late Victorian window, the traditional landmarks are still casting very long shadows. The territorial aristocracy, they continue to dominate the rural counties almost entirely.
They're still running the show in the countryside.
Oh, absolutely. They still dictate the rhythms of high society in London. They're still hosting these massive socially exclusive gatherings at their sprawling country estates. But at the very same moment, the individualist businessman is thriving in the urban centers.
Building his entire identity around the virtues of bourgeois self-help and entrepreneurial grit.
Exactly.
Those are the classic Victorian archetypes we usually picture, right? The aristocrat in the manor and the self-made industrialist in the city, pulling himself up by his bootstraps.
They are. But the crucial inflection point of the late 1860s is that these classes no longer monopolize the cultural narrative, not the way they did in the earlier part of the century during the era of politicians like Palmerston and Peel.
Things are fracturing.
The foundational ideas those older classes represent are suddenly facing intense scrutiny. And it's not just a fringe movement. Everyone is getting pulled into the conversation.
The whole society.
Across all social strata. The unquestioned, inherited creeds of the early Victorian period are being replaced by active, free debate. Society is essentially dismantling the structural supports of its house while still living inside it.
Which is wild to think about. It feels like there must have been a catalyst. Because a society doesn't just wake up one day and decide to interrogate its entire social hierarchy. What actually lit the match in the 1860s?
If you're looking for the intellectual spark, you really have to look at John Stuart Mill. Specifically, the publication of his work Liberty in 1859.
Okay.
Mill didn't just write a philosophical treatise. He essentially preached a doctrine of intellectual revolt. He explicitly targeted the tame acceptance of conventional opinions.
Because for decades prior, Victorian society was governed by this highly rigid, unspoken consensus, right?
Absolutely. Regarding propriety, morality, social order, you adhered to conventional wisdom because stepping outside of it invited complete social ruin.
We'd be ostracized.
Mill argued that this reflexive acceptance of the status quo was a prison. And the historical record shows that within just a dozen years of liberty hitting the shelves, this attitude of relentless questioning became the dominant cultural mood.
Mm.
England rapidly transitioned into a highly liberal, outspoken age.
And you can actually see that shift reflected in who society decided to idolize. We went from venerating the aristocrat who inherited his land or the merchant who built his shop to a completely different kind of role model.
The representative men.
Yes. The new representative men of the era were men of university education, men defined by trained professional intelligence. We're talking about the readers of Mill, Darwin, and Huxley, the consumers of George Eliot and Robert Browning.
Even the popular press picked up on it.
Right, like Punch magazine. They started exclusively caricaturing these gentlemanly, bearded intellectuals because they had become the new center of cultural gravity.
And that pivot in the societal ideal is an enormous indicator of where the actual power was moving. The concepts of democracy, bureaucracy, and collectivism were advancing. Trevelyan describes it beautifully. He calls it a silent tide, making in by 100 creeks and inlets.
I love that phrase.
It's perfect because it's not a violent revolution that storms the barricades. It's a rising tide of administration and meritocracy that slowly fills every available crevice until the entire landscape has been remapped.
I want to look at those specific creeks and inlets for a second, because when you examine the legislative record between 1870 and 1875, it is just a staggering avalanche of reform.
It's relentless.
I really struggle to wrap my head around how much the social contract was rewritten in just 5 years. We have the Reform Bill of 1867, which handed the parliamentary vote to the working men of the towns.
Massive shift.
But it's the 1870 introduction of competitive exams for the civil service that really stands out to me. Because before this, government administration was basically a friends and family network for the aristocracy, wasn't it?
It was the ultimate system of patronage. If your family had political leverage or you were friendly with a duke, you were granted a comfortable position in public office regardless of your actual competence.
Just a total old boys club.
And the aristocratic political class genuinely believed that selecting men for the administration of the empire based on an academic exam was a laughable concept.
They thought it was ridiculous.
And they did. But in 1870, Gladstone abolished that system of patronage. The new objective was to systematically recruit the most capable young men from the universities into a formalized modern bureaucracy.
So trained intellect literally replaces aristocratic bloodlines as the passport to public power.
Precise.
And then they pair that with Forster's Act in 1870, which finally established primary education for all. They are simultaneously trying to build a universally literate populace while turning the mechanics of government into a pure meritocracy.
And they didn't stop there. They extended that meritocratic principle to the highest levels of academia the very next year. The Universities Test Act of 1871 is a monumental piece of legislation.
Because it threw open the doors of Oxford and Cambridge to everyone, regardless of their religious belief.
Exactly.
Which means before 1871, the two most prestigious educational institutions in the world were legally functioning as closed shops for the Church of England.
You had to pass religious tests to hold academic posts. Abolishing those tests broke the centuries-old monopolies the church held over higher education. And as those religious barriers fell, the academic curriculum itself was forced to evolve.
To modernize.
Yes. For generations, Oxford and Cambridge were almost entirely dominated by the study of classics and mathematics. But suddenly, physical science, along with medieval and modern history, began taking their rightful place alongside the traditional humanities. You had brilliant scientific minds like Clerk Maxwell and J.J. Thomson altering the entire intellectual atmosphere at Cambridge.
And as if completely restructuring government and higher education wasn't enough, right in that same window between 1871 and 1875, trade unions are granted a new charter of rights to match their growing industrial leverage.
It's dizzying.
So just think about this. In less than a decade, the urban working class gets the vote, the government adopts a merit-based bureaucracy, primary education becomes universal, religious discrimination is banned at top universities, science enters the curriculum, and organized labor gets legal standing.
The friction that must have caused among the old guard had to be immense.
Oh, it had to be. But what is truly remarkable is that while the nation's political and intellectual classes were intensely focused on managing this progressive urban revolution, they completely failed to notice an existential crisis quietly devouring the rural foundation of the country.
Which brings us to the catastrophe in the countryside.
Mm.
The text we are looking at explicitly labels this the greatest single event of the 1870s, fraught with immeasurable consequences for the future.
Right. Around 1875, English agriculture simply collapses.
To understand the magnitude of this, you have to realize that for 2 centuries, English agriculture wasn't just farming. It was a highly capitalized, scientifically managed, and deeply entrenched system built around massive estates.
It was the backbone of the traditional social order.
Exactly. And it was entirely dismantled in a matter of years by a fundamental rewiring of the global supply chain.
So how does an institution with hundreds of years of momentum just evaporate?
It was a perfect storm of geography and technology. First, you have the sudden agricultural development of the American prairies in the Middle West.
We're talking about an unfathomable expanse of virgin soil.
Yes. And combine that virgin soil with the invention of new, highly efficient agricultural machinery. The farmers of the American Middle West were able to skim the cream off these vast territories at a fraction of the cost it took to farm the heavily managed, expensive English estates.
But producing cheap grain in America is only half the battle. I mean, you still have to transport thousands of tons of it across the Atlantic to actually undercut the market in London.
And that is where the revolution in transport seals the fate of the English aristocrat. Massive new railway networks were built to carry this cheap grain from the American interior to the coastal ports.
Right, the rail boom.
And from there, the newly invented transatlantic steamships hauled it across the ocean with unprecedented speed and volume. The English estates, with their elaborate and expensive methods of high farming, simply could not compete with the sheer scale of American mass production.
Trevelyan frames it with this striking irony. He says the centuries-old British landed aristocracy was ultimately overthrown by the distant democracy of American prairie farmers.
It's a staggering historical irony.
It really is. But I am struggling to understand the government's total inaction here. You have a government watching its own foundational industry, the literal food supply of its island, just evaporate. Were they truly that blinded by economic theory, or was it a calculated political move? Because other European nations saw the exact same American grain ships arriving, and they took immediate action.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really comes down to a clash between deeply entrenched ideology and historical trauma. The other states of Europe still maintained a large peasantry, and their governments valued that peasant class as a crucial, stabilizing element of their social fabric.
So when cheap American food threatened to wipe them out, European leaders immediately threw up protective tariffs.
Right. They shielded their domestic agriculture. England refused to even consider such a policy.
Because they were entirely beholden to the doctrine of free trade.
Yes. To the Victorian mind, free trade was the sacred engine of their global supremacy. They believed their unprecedented wealth and imperial power were securely built on the foundation of unrestricted world commerce.
But there was more to it than just theory, wasn't there?
Much more. Beyond the economic theory, there was a visceral, lingering trauma from earlier in the century. The memories of the Hungry 40s were still very fresh.
Ah, the era of the Corn Laws.
Exactly. The Corn Laws had been a system of tariffs on imported grain, and they had kept the price of bread artificially high, leading to immense suffering and starvation among the poor.
Which is awful.
By the 1870s, the demographic and political balance of power had firmly shifted from the rural countryside to the industrial towns. The urban intellect and the urban working class dictated policy.
So no politician in their right mind was going to advocate for a return to protective tariffs if it meant the price of a loaf of bread for a factory worker was going to increase.
Exactly. It was the ghost of Richard Cobden, the great champion of free trade, dictating the fate of the nation from beyond the grave.
Which makes the position of Benjamin Disraeli so deeply fascinating to me. Back in 1846, Disraeli had loudly prophesied that embracing free trade in corn would inevitably lead to the total ruin of English agriculture.
He called it.
He did. And for 30 years, his critics mocked him because the economy actually boomed. But then, in the late 1870s, his prophecy comes true to the letter. And where is Disraeli when the collapse he predicted finally arrives?
He is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
It is almost Shakespearean. He literally has the power to intervene, and he does nothing.
The historical analysis notes that Disraeli, in his twilight years, was entirely immersed in his grand imperial foreign policies. He made absolutely no attempt to oppose the prevailing spirit of the age on the domestic front.
He gave up the fight.
He had, for all practical intents, surrendered to the free trade doctrine he once despised. He allowed the very curse he had warned against to blight the English cornfields.
And the broader intelligentsia, the liberals, the conservatives, the journalists, they essentially offered a collective shrug. They were so saturated with free trade logic that they viewed agriculture as just another line item on a ledger.
Their argument was that if free competition destroys the farming industry, other manufacturing industries will naturally absorb the capital and the labor, and the national ledger will just balance out.
But this raises such an important question, and it's perhaps the most profound critique leveled at the Victorian policymakers. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were losing.
How so?
While political economy doesn't encompass the entirety of human welfare, the men of theory completely failed to perceive that agriculture is not just another industry like making textiles or forging steel. It is an intrinsic way of life. The human and spiritual values connected to the land are unique and irreplaceable.
The unseen cost of this economic calculus is massive. The text argues that this collapse resulted in the permanent psychological and cultural severance of the Englishman from the natural world.
Right, because for every previous generation, daily contact with the soil, the seasons, the landscape, it had fundamentally shaped the imagination and the character of the island race. And they just let that connection die on the altar of cheap bread.
And the scale of the erasure is breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
Within the first decade of this decline, the amount of land dedicated to growing wheat in England plummeted by nearly 1 million acres.
1 million acres, just abandoned or repurposed. So what happens to the generations of agricultural laborers, the people whose entire lineage has been tied to that dirt?
They vanish from the countryside. The agricultural laborer did not stubbornly cling to the land when his livelihood disappeared.
They didn't strike a revolt.
No.
Did it?
If you look at an unemployed coal miner in the industrial north, they might linger around a closed pit for years, trapped by circumstance. But the English farm worker just slipped away. As wages fell and jobs vanished, he packed up and migrated into the sprawling urban towns. Or he boarded a ship and emigrated entirely.
And unlike the Irish peasant who harbored a fierce, passionate attachment to his specific family plot, the English rural laborer was ultimately a hireling working someone else's estate.
Exactly. He was already accustomed to the idea that his labor was a commodity. He was aware of the industrial towns. He knew about the higher wages and the opportunities they offered. He possessed a very pragmatic desire to better his station in life.
So the exodus was quiet but absolute.
By 1881, the census data shows 100,000 fewer farm laborers than just a decade prior. And that was merely the vanguard of the migration.
And the rural economy couldn't just pivot because the technological advancements kept undercutting them. When the wheat market collapsed, entire regions in the West, the Midlands, and the North tried to adapt by laying down grass and substituting cattle for sheep. They tried to become the butchers for the cities.
Logical pivot.
Right. But then in the 1880s and 1890s, the refrigeration of ships is perfected. Suddenly, frozen meat from Australia, New Zealand, and South America floods the London markets. The livestock trade is ruined just as swiftly and brutally as the grain trade.
The compounding stress broke the back of the rural economy. Landlords lost their capital reserves and could no longer maintain the estates. Farmers lost their recuperative power. Vital practices like land drainage were practically abandoned.
The soil itself deteriorated.
Less labor was employed, fewer animals were kept.
Oh.
The irony is that the counties which suffered the most catastrophic losses were the exact corn-growing districts where high farming had previously achieved its greatest scientific triumphs.
Even their forests were abandoned. Because the government no longer needed domestic oak to build battleships for the Royal Navy, timber began pouring in from Scandinavia and North America at prices that made domestic forestry a joke.
It was cheaper to import.
Completely.
Yeah.
The massive demand for wooden pit props in the coal mines and timber for the urban housing boom was entirely supplied from overseas. The English landlords stopped managing their woodlands commercially and just left them as scenic backdrops for shooting game.
And this total abandonment of the rural landscape highlights a deeply ingrained short-sightedness in late Victorian state policy. They were a civilization completely incapable of laying far-reaching plans for national security.
They were highly reactive.
Very. They were perfectly willing to modernize the civil service or the universities because the immediate administrative pressure was obvious. But the idea that they might need to sustain a domestic food supply to survive a future war, it never seriously entered their calculus.
Because they felt untouchable.
Exactly. After enjoying 2 generations of absolute safety following the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, they had convinced themselves that existential national danger was an artifact of the past.
They genuinely believed they had reached the end of history, which provides a perfect contrast to our next major theme: the sudden, jarring loss of that exact complacency and the rise of terrifying new global rivals.
Right.
In the 1850s, following the Great Exhibition, England was radiating the smug, almost unbearable cocksureness. But the 1870s delivered a very rude awakening.
It is difficult to overstate the sheer arrogance of mid-Victorian England. For decades, they had served as the undisputed workshop of the world. They were manufacturing goods for a global market that was, technologically speaking, an entire generation behind them.
They were miles ahead.
Their only conceivable military rival was the France of Napoleon III, which they viewed with mild irritation rather than genuine fear. The historian Macaulay captured the prevailing mood perfectly when he noted that Englishmen rejoiced in the belief that their wealth, liberty, and order made them the envy of less happier lands.
The envy of less happier lands is such a wonderfully condescending phrase.
Very Victorian.
But that bubble of superiority bursts violently with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Suddenly, the map of Europe is redrawn, and a unified, highly militarized, ruthlessly efficient German empire emerges right in the center of the continent.
And over the next 30 years, both Germany and the United States rise with terrifying speed to challenge England's manufacturing supremacy.
And the nature of the threat from these two emerging powers was fundamentally different, wasn't it?
It was. The United States possessed practically infinite natural resources and a massive internal market that was finally being fully integrated and exploited.
Just sheer scale.
Right. Germany, however, represented a much more deliberate strategic threat. The German state was actively and heavily investing in the scientific and technical education of its citizens. They were engineering a highly skilled workforce from the top down.
So you have America overwhelming them with sheer resources and Germany out-engineering them with state-sponsored education. It is a very modern anxiety.
It really echoes today.
It's exactly what it feels like today when a reigning global superpower suddenly realizes its economic and technological dominance is slipping. Your competitors are hungrier, they are securing better resources, and they are out-educating you.
And this realization sent a shockwave of anxiety through the English intelligentsia. They began to suspect that their cherished island liberty, their absolute devotion to free trade, and their reliance on individualist self-help were no longer sufficient tools to maintain their global position.
They had to wake up.
The English, who had largely ignored the internal workings of Germany prior to 1870, suddenly developed a profound, nervous interest in their new rival. Thinkers like Matthew Arnold and George Meredith explicitly warned the public that their rigorous national education and discipline being forged in the Teutonic heart of Europe was creating a formidable new power.
A power that was casting a very jealous eye on England's carelessly guarded and deeply unequal wealth.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just the external threat of Germany or America that had them panicked. The internal distribution of that wealth was coming under massive sustained critique. You start seeing social profits gaining huge platforms, arguing that the moral fabric of the country is rotting.
John Ruskin is the towering figure in this regard. Ruskin utilized his immense public popularity to act as a deeply critical social prophet. He didn't just critique the economy, he critiqued the soul of the nation.
He went after the culture itself.
He loudly denounced the way this vaunted Victorian wealth was being deployed to actively destroy the natural beauty of the country. Furthermore, he argued that the grotesque inequality of this wealth was a dual poison. It was morally corrupting the superfluously rich, while physically and spiritually degrading the miserably poor.
So the reaction to this cocktail of external threats and internal moral panic is fascinating. On the domestic front, they finally acknowledge the need to vastly improve their own technical and scientific education to compete with the Germans. But on the global stage, they pivot hard.
They rethink everything.
Right. This era births the imperialist movement of the 1890s. After decades of somewhat ignoring their colonies, there is a sudden, desperate, renewed interest in the lands beyond the sea. They start actively courting closer ties with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Consolidating the empire.
Exactly, and perhaps most tellingly, the English political class adopts a much friendlier, far more respectful diplomatic posture toward the United States, which is a stark contrast to the hostility they displayed during the American Civil War just a few decades earlier. They realize they need allies.
The illusion of splendid isolation was shattering. They recognized that standing utterly alone and aloof was no longer a viable strategy in a multipolar world.
But what is vital to understand about this period is the immense disconnect between the macroeconomic anxieties of the ruling class and the daily lived experience of the average citizen.
This is such an important point.
Because while the intellectuals were agonizing over German technical schools and the collapse of the wheat market, The actual day-to-day standard of living for the majority of the population was experiencing an unprecedented boom.
Despite the rural catastrophe and the rise of foreign rivals, the final 30 years of Victoria's reign were characterized by massive, widespread prosperity. The wealth of the nation was increasing, and crucially, large sections of the working and middle classes were actually getting a share of it.
When you look at the Queen's Jubilees in 1887 and 1897, the massive public celebrations were not just state-mandated propaganda. They were expressions of genuine, deeply felt national pride.
The texture of daily life was softening, manners became noticeably gentler, the urban streets became markedly safer, and the overall administration of society was becoming more humane.
Even the sanitation improved.
Drastically. The horrific sanitation issues that plagued the early Victorian cities were being rapidly mitigated by massive public works. Working-class housing, while still deplorable in many districts, was objectively better than it had been a generation prior.
Labor conditions had improved, real wages possessed more purchasing power, and the grueling hours of the factory week had finally been shortened.
And we have to talk about the tax burden.
Oh, yes. The numbers from this era are almost incomprehensible to a modern taxpayer.
The free trade financial policies established by Peel and Gladstone had systematically stripped away indirect taxation to relieve the burden on the poor. But what about the income tax?
The records indicate that in the 1880s, the income tax fluctuated from a bare 2 pence in the pound to a maximum of a mere 6 pence halfpenny.
It was a microscopic, almost negligible burden. The state asked very little of the citizen's wallet.
So when you combine rising real wages, shortened working hours, and historically low taxation, you get the mass democratization of something that had previously been an exclusive luxury of the rich.
Free time.
The invention of the modern concept of leisure.
Hmm.
This is the exact moment when the seaside holiday transforms from an aristocratic retreat into a standard expectation for the lower middle class and increasingly the industrial working class.
The rapid evolution of Blackpool is the perfect case study here. By 1876, Blackpool had exploded in size and achieved the status of a borough, almost entirely because it had become the designated destination for the annual holiday of the Lancashire artisan class.
It became the go-to spot.
Meanwhile, the more distant, rugged coastlines of Cornwall evolved into the preferred August retreat for the well-to-do middle classes. You suddenly had throngs of urban children and their parents wading into tidal pools in remote fishing hamlets.
Which, ironically, provided at least a fleeting manufactured reconnection with the natural world they had lost during the agricultural collapse.
A brief escape from the city.
And it wasn't just the grand annual holiday that emerged. The concept of the weekend, as we know it, was born right here. Historically, staying in town and attending church on Sunday was the rigid expectation for the urban middle class for all 7 days of the week.
Right.
Escaping to a country house for the weekend was strictly a pastime for the ultra-wealthy. But in the late Victorian era, the idea of the weekend cottage or the weekend excursion out of town began to filter down to the middle classes. They were actively seeking an escape valve from the pressures of urban life.
And their horizons were expanding far beyond the English coastline. While the domestic population was discovering the joys of exploring their own countryside on foot, or increasingly by bicycle, a massive new industry of foreign tourism was taking shape.
Thomas Cook.
Yes, Thomas Cook's famous organized tours essentially commodified continental travel, making the art, culture, and landscapes of France, Switzerland, and Italy accessible to multitudes of the thrifty middle-class public.
You even saw an explosion of extreme leisure, with English academics and professionals hiring Swiss guides to pioneer the sport of mountaineering, systematically conquering the great, terrifying summits of the Alps for sport.
It's a whole new world of movement.
It really is. And this expansion of physical horizons directly parallels what is arguably the most significant social shift of the era, the physical and societal emancipation of women.
This is crucial.
We discussed J.S. Mill's Subjection of Women, published in 1869, which provided the intellectual framework for demanding professional and social equality. And we saw major legislative victories like the Married Women's Property Act,
Which was a monumental paradigm shift because it finally legally untethered a woman's inherited wealth or earned income from her husband's control.
Right. We also see the founding of the first women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. But the historical analysis points to something much more visceral than legislation. It argues that the adoption of sports and physical movement revolutionized the daily lives of women faster than any law could.
The physical liberation catalyzed the social liberation. As women began to participate more actively in physical recreation, the suffocating dictates of Victorian fashion were forced to adapt.
They had to be able to move.
Exactly. They became more athletic, they began walking for pleasure, and consequently their skirts became shorter and vastly less encumbering. The massive, physically restrictive crinoline, which literally dictated how much space a woman could occupy and how she could move, was finally discarded.
Along with the heavy sweeping dresses that drag through the mud.
And the nature of the recreation itself evolved so quickly. In the 1870s, you have women playing croquet on the lawn, which is leisurely but still quite static.
Standing around.
But by the 1880s, that is replaced by the highly active, physically demanding movements of lawn tennis. But the true engine of liberation arrives in the 1890s with the perfection of the bicycle.
Oh, the bicycle changed everything.
When the design of the bicycle shifted from the precarious, highly dangerous high-wheel models to the modern, equal-sized low wheels with pneumatic tires, it became an absolute cultural phenomenon.
For women, the bicycle was an engine of unprecedented personal autonomy. It allowed them to travel miles across the countryside, either alone or in the company of men, completely free from the watchful, suffocating eye of a chaperone. It literally broke the physical boundaries of their domestic sphere.
And as individuals were gaining mobility, the rigid boundaries between social classes were also beginning to blur. Society was becoming markedly more fluid.
The analysis points to the memoirs of John Buchan, who provides a brilliant snapshot of London high society right on the eve of the South African War in 1899. Buchan observes that while the aesthetic of London was still heavily aristocratic, men strictly wearing frock coats and top hats, engaging in highly ritualized Sunday social calls where conversation was treated as a delicate art form, the actual guest list in those drawing rooms was changing.
The gates were opening.
The ancient, heavily guarded gates of aristocratic society were quietly being breached by what he called men of mere wealth. The newly rich industrialists and top-tier professionals were buying their way into the elite spaces.
What is particularly fascinating is the demographic transformation occurring quietly behind the closed doors of those middle and upper-class homes. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the large, sprawling Victorian family remained the absolute cultural standard across the professional, business, and working classes.
It was the era defined by the crowded middle-class nursery, filled with rocking horses and flocks of siblings.
And the population was booming because advancements in urban sanitation and medical science had caused infant mortality to plummet. In 1886, England's excess of births over deaths was sitting at an incredibly high 13.3.
Which is massive when you compare it to a country like France, which was at a stagnant 1.4.
But as the 1890s approached, the era of the massive family began to wane. We see a deliberate, statistically significant reduction in family size.
And this contraction began first among the professional and middle classes, didn't it?
Yes. They were feeling the intense financial pressure of paying heavy fees to send their sons to prestigious public schools to secure their place in the new meritocracy. We also see the family size shrinking among the more prosperous, forward-thinking artisans.
And this wasn't just a natural biological shift. It was driven by a highly controversial, highly public catalyst.
Yes, the turning point in the public consciousness occurred in 1877 with the explosive trial of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant.
The pamphlet trial.
They were prosecuted by the state for deliberately publishing and distributing a neo-Malthusian pamphlet. Thomas Malthus, decades earlier, had famously theorized that human population would inevitably outstrip the global food supply, leading to mass starvation.
A terrifying thought.
The neo-Malthusian movement took this anxiety and proposed a practical, highly taboo solution: artificial birth control. The high-profile prosecution of Bradlaugh and Besant essentially served as the first massive nationwide advertisement for contraceptive methods.
But there is a deeply cynical, dark irony in how this actually played out. The reformers who published the pamphlet were primarily motivated by a desire to alleviate the crushing, cyclical poverty of the urban slum populations. They wanted to give the poorest families the tools to stop having children they couldn't afford to feed.
Right, a social mission.
But the slum populations entirely ignored the advice. Instead, it was the educated, financially stable middle classes, the families possessing the best resources to raise and educate children, who eagerly adopted the practices.
The historical text dramatically refers to this demographic trend as the beginning of race suicide in the approaching 20th century.
That intense friction between the rational scientific advice offered by social reformers and the deep-seated traditional moral behavior of the populace, it perfectly encapsulates the defining intellectual conflict of the late Victorian era. We are looking at a society experiencing a profound existential crisis of faith.
Let's dive deep into this, because the collision between religion and science in this era is the heavyweight intellectual bout of the century.
The absolute bedrock of English society in the mid-19th century was a towering, imposing fabric of religious certainty.
Whether you were high church, emphasizing ritual and tradition, or low church, focusing on evangelical preaching, or a nonconformist operating entirely outside the Church of England, almost everyone shared a foundational belief in the literal, verbal inspiration of the Bible.
But the relentless march of scientific discovery was systematically eroding that foundation.
And the inescapable epicenter of this seismic shift is Charles Darwin. It is crucial to understand Darwin's personal disposition here. Unlike Enlightenment figures such as Voltaire, who aggressively and gleefully attacked religious institutions, Darwin was an incredibly gentle, deeply human figure who had absolutely no desire to be an iconoclast.
He wasn't trying to destroy the church.
He did not view the church as an enemy to be destroyed. And indeed, upon his death, the religious establishment reverently buried him in Westminster Abbey. However, the unavoidable conclusions drawn from his meticulous scientific researches were fundamentally entirely incompatible with the narrative presented in the early chapters of Genesis.
And to the Victorian mind, the book of Genesis was not treated as a collection of metaphorical parables. It was considered the literal, factual, historical record of the world, just as unassailable as the New Testament.
The broader implication of evolutionary theory, this scandalous idea that mankind descended from a lower primate, was a direct assault on the deeply comforting religious doctrine that mankind was the special, central, deliberately crafted focal point of the entire universe.
Confronted with this existential threat, the religious establishment naturally mobilized to defend doctrines that possess the prestige of dateless antiquity. They fought back fiercely.
Conversely, a younger, highly militant generation of scientific men rallied to defend Darwin. They were determined to establish once and for all the absolute right of the scientific method to follow the evidence wherever it led, completely unconstrained by the dictates of ancient theology.
This intellectual war raged relentlessly through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It wasn't just an abstract debate in lecture halls. It caused profound psychological anguish, tore families apart, and plunged the educated classes into a period of deep, agonizing soul-searching.
But what I find utterly fascinating is the paradox of the victors.
The agnostics.
Yes, the prominent intellectuals who ultimately abandoned the theology, the men who proudly adopted the newly coined term agnostics, did not abandon the rigid morality of the religion they left behind.
Right. You have figures like T.H. Huxley, Darwin's most aggressive champion, who openly and fiercely defied the authority of the clergy. You have brilliant writers like Leslie Stephen and John Morley, who utterly refused to compromise their intellect by pretending to believe dogmas they knew to be false.
Yet these same men maintained a personal moral code that was as strict, ascetic, and demanding as any 17th century Puritan.
It's incredible. The biography of Leslie Stephen is the perfect embodiment of this era. He actually began his career as an ordained clergyman before his intellect forced him to resign his orders.
This period witnessed a fascinating, quasi-religious movement away from religion itself. These leading agnostics were deeply puritanical in their daily conduct and outlook.
Matthew Arnold, whom the era hailed as the great prophet of culture, famously asserted that conduct is 3 parts of life.
They believed that morality was not dependent on divine reward or punishment. It was a societal imperative. The massive popularity of George Eliot's novels during this time was largely because she brilliantly translated this exact philosophy into fiction.
She restated the absolute necessity of the moral law in a secular vocabulary that was deeply comforting to the rationalist, agnostic conscience.
They successfully surgically removed the supernatural theology, but completely retained the behavioral strictures. This agnosticism had absolutely nothing to do with hedonism or moral decay. It was a deeply serious, almost grim commitment to ethical duty.
But while the intellectual elite are wrestling with Darwin in the universities, the everyday religious experience of the common citizen was undergoing its own radical transformation.
The deeply ingrained tradition of family religion, the practice of gathering in the parlor for strict Sunday readings of the Bible, or Milton's Paradise Lost, accompanied by daily mandated family prayers, it was rapidly fading into obscurity.
By 1889, senior academics at Cambridge were noting with surprise that the hallmark Victorian piety of home prayers had become virtually extinct in many circles.
Religion was quietly transitioning from a highly public, universally mandated system of societal organization into a private, highly individualized provision for personal spiritual needs.
And as traditional religious practice vacated the quiet domestic parlor, it reemerged in the public square in incredibly vibrant, highly visible alternative forms. This is the exact era that births the Salvation Army.
Founded by General William Booth.
Yes, the Salvation Army took the fervent, emotional enthusiasm of religious conversion straight out of the respectable pews and marched it directly into the most destitute, dangerous slums of the industrial cities.
And their methodology was entirely radical for its time. They discarded the solemnity of the traditional church service and instead deployed loud street bands and brightly colored militaristic uniforms to capture the attention of the urban poor.
But their true historical significance lies in their underlying philosophy.
Exactly. The Salvation Army officially recognized that conducting social work and actively improving the horrific material conditions of the outcast was not secondary to the Christian mission. It was an essential prerequisite.
They understood a fundamental truth that the older churches often ignored. You cannot effectively preach spiritual salvation to a man who is starving, freezing, or consumed by alcoholism. You must address the social rot first.
Speaking of alcoholism, we cannot discuss the social rot of the Victorian city without examining the temperance movement, because drunkenness and the ruinous financial expenditure associated with it was universally recognized as one of the most devastating scourges of urban life.
The records indicate it was the primary engine driving urban crime, domestic violence, and the total financial ruin of the working-class family.
The temperance movement, which drew massive support from the nonconformist congregations, evolved into an incredibly powerful social and political force. They pioneered highly visible public campaigns, most notably the Blue Ribbon Army.
Individuals who took a solemn pledge of total abstinence would pin a blue ribbon to their chest,
Wearing it constantly to publicly declare their sobriety and to fortify their resolve in the face of a culture saturated with cheap gin and beer. However, the historical consensus suggests that moral fanaticism and pledges were not the primary cure for the epidemic of drunkenness.
Right. The cure was actually the sudden availability of alternative dopamine hits. The increase in rival amusements saved the working class. The expansion of public libraries, the proliferation of cheap printed music, the freedom of the bicycle, and those seaside holidays we discussed earlier.
All of these new avenues of leisure provided a desperately needed escape valve, counteracting the exhausted laborer's reflex to drown his misery in a bottle.
Even the invention of cheap photography played a massive, unexpected role in social cohesion.
Oh, absolutely. There's a wonderfully poignant quote from a social observer in 1871 who declared that cheap photography was the greatest boon that has been conferred on the poorer classes in later years.
Because before this, possessing an image of a loved one was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to commission a painted portrait.
Now, for mere sixpence, a working-class mother could have a photograph of a son who had emigrated to the Canadian prairies or a daughter who had moved to London for factory work. These cheap photographs kept the vital bonds of family affection alive across vast distances, providing a crucial emotional anchor against the atomizing, miserable tendencies of industrial urban life.
And while society was finding these new ways to cope, the massive brewing companies, which were now heavily backed by armies of corporate investors, were slowly being shamed, or perhaps terrified by the temperance movement, into adopting more enlightened business practices.
They began to exert stricter control over the public houses they owned, demanding they be run decently, and actively discouraging the landlords from serving customers until they were dangerously intoxicated.
You touched on a critical phrase there. You said the brewing companies were backed by armies of corporate investors. This leads us directly into another massive structural transformation of late Victorian society. We must examine the sprawling evolution of corporate capitalism and the changing, increasingly hostile relationship between capital and labor.
This is a monumental pivot. The very architecture of how business was conducted was rewritten. As the second half of the 19th century progressed, both capital and labor were aggressively enlarging, consolidating, and perfecting their rival organizations.
The traditional patriarchal family firm where the owner lived near the mill and knew his workers by name was rapidly being replaced by the vast, faceless, limited liability company run by a bureaucracy of salaried managers.
The legislative creation and explosive growth of the limited liability company fundamentally altered the moral landscape of British industry. It birthed a massive new demographic, the rentier class of shareholders.
These were individuals who possessed wealth completely detached from the physical realities of land ownership, and even more dangerously, completely detached from the practical responsibilities of business management.
They were irresponsible in the most literal definitional sense of the word. They held absolutely no responsibilities.
You have entire towns, places like Bournemouth and Eastbourne, springing up seemingly overnight for the sole purpose of housing this large, comfortable class of people who had retired to the coast to live off their investments.
Their entire relationship to the broader society consisted of waiting for their dividend checks to arrive in the post, and perhaps occasionally traveling to a shareholders' meeting to scream at the salaried managers for not squeezing enough profit out of the margins.
Let's frame this in a modern context because it is the exact same dynamic we see today in the gig economy. You have algorithms and shareholders in Silicon Valley dictating the wages and working conditions of a delivery driver in London, with absolutely zero understanding of the physical reality of that driver's daily life.
The analogy is perfect. The Victorian shareholder possessed no knowledge of the lives, the daily thoughts, the housing conditions, or the physical needs of the workmen employed by the massive company in which he held his shares.
His influence on the delicate ecosystem of capital and labor was almost uniformly disastrous because his only metric was the dividend.
And even the salaried manager, who was physically present at the factory acting on behalf of the remote shareholders, rarely possessed that familiar paternalistic knowledge of the workmen that characterized the old family business. The sheer staggering scale of modern industrial operations rendered such personal human relations mathematically impossible.
It was the ultimate corporate disconnect. The owners of the coal mine are strolling along the promenade in Bournemouth, utterly blind to the grim, dangerous reality of the pit. And because the individual workman is now entirely powerless against this massive, faceless corporate bureaucracy, the trade unions transition from being helpful associations into absolute life-or-death necessities.
Fortunately, the organizational capability and the sheer numerical strength of the trade unions were increasing concurrently with the rise of the corporations. This collective power finally enabled the workmen to negotiate with the corporate managers on somewhat equal footing.
The harsh, brutal discipline of prolonged strikes and retaliatory lockouts functioned as a crucible, eventually teaching both capital and labor to begrudgingly respect each other's capacity to inflict economic pain.
But securing the legal right to wield that power was an incredibly bitter, protracted war in the courts.
Bitter doesn't even begin to cover it. The legal history of unions in this era is a chaotic roller coaster of judicial hostility. Back in 1825, Parliament had actually legalized trade unions for the specific purpose of negotiating wages. The matter seemed settled.
But then, in 1867, the judges of the law courts, led by the Lord Chief Justice himself, executed a stunning piece of judicial gymnastics. They suddenly decreed that unions were, in fact, illegal associations because their actions constituted a restraint of trade.
It was a breathtaking example of judicial overreach by an aristocratic legal establishment deeply hostile to working-class power. The law courts developed a highly frustrating, recurring habit of examining the legislation passed by Parliament legislation, explicitly intended to grant liberties to trade unions, and ruling that, due to obscure legal technicalities, those liberties had not actually been granted at all.
So the politicians have to constantly step in to overrule the judges. Gladstone has to pass the Act of 1871 just to restore the union's basic right to exist and protect their funds. Then Disraeli follows up with the Act of 1875, which finally legalizes the crucial tactic of peaceful picketing.
After that, the judges retreat and leave them alone for about a generation. This allows unionism to massively expand its footprint, moving beyond the elite skilled trades and organizing the massive unskilled labor force. Most famously culminating in the great successful strike of the London dockers led by John Burns in 1889.
But the judicial establishment was merely biding its time. Right at the very end of the century, in 1901, the judges struck their most devastating blow with the infamous Taff Vale decision.
Utilizing incredibly strained legal logic, they effectively undid decades of parliamentary work by ruling that a trade union could be sued for the financial damages caused by a strike. By holding union funds liable, they made the very act of striking functionally illegal once again.
And this blatant attempt by the establishment to legally crush the labor movement backfired in the most spectacular historic way imaginable.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation by the ruling class. The sheer outrage over the Taff Vale decision finally convinced the disparate labor organizations that relying on the goodwill of the liberal or conservative parties was a dead end.
That single judicial ruling acted as the immediate catalyst for the formation of a completely independent, highly disciplined Labour Party in Parliament at the dawn of the new century. By attempting to destroy the unions in the courts, the establishment inadvertently handed them a permanent, immensely powerful political weapon.
Now, running parallel to this sprawling story of corporate bureaucracy and legal warfare, there is a brilliant, highly specific observation in Trevelyan's analysis that I absolutely love. To accommodate this new, highly technical, heavily administered reality, the English language itself had to be fundamentally re-engineered.
The evolution of the vocabulary is a perfect mirror for the evolution of the society. The analysis draws a fascinating comparison between the end of Queen Victoria's reign and the end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign 3 centuries prior.
It notes that while a late Victorian reader could effortlessly comprehend the poetry of Shakespeare or the prose of the 1611 King James Bible, if you handed an Elizabethan a Victorian newspaper editorial or a corporate prospectus, they would be utterly, hopelessly bewildered.
They would be drowning in a sea of newly invented, multisyllabic jargon. The Victorians were constantly minting new words, usually bolting together Latin and Greek roots.
But they weren't creating words for the purposes of poetry or emotional resonance. They weren't trying to write Shakespeare's "The multitudinous seas incarnadine."
No, they were constructing a vocabulary specifically designed for the cold, prosaic purposes of scientific classification, bureaucratic administration, and the dry discussion of sociological problems.
We are talking about the mass introduction of words like opportunist, minimize, international, centrifugal, commercialism, decentralize, and organization.
A literary critic of the time perfectly categorized this new lexicon as a useful but unlovely jargon. The language of science and bureaucracy cares absolutely nothing for emotional depth, aesthetic beauty, or vivid imagery.
Its ultimate ideal is to function like algebraic notation. It actively prefers dry, abstract, highly specific terms excavated from dead languages to ensure absolute precision.
The English language was transitioning from a vehicle primarily designed for poetry, romance, and emotion into a utilitarian tool optimized for journalism, engineering, and corporate management.
An undeniably useful but thoroughly unlovely jargon, explicitly designed to navigate an increasingly unlovely physical landscape, which provides a seamless, if somewhat depressing, transition into our final major area of exploration, the physical environment of this newly motorized bureaucratic society. We need to examine what the analysis bleakly refers to as the mean streets and the incredibly dangerous paradox of modern education.
When you study the physical expansion of modern England during this period, the defining characteristic is its horrifying, chaotic lack of planning. The state, adhering strictly to its laissez-faire principles, permitted private landlords and speculative housing builders to lay out the expanding footprint of modern England entirely according to the dictates of maximum private profit.
Absolutely no forethought was given to civic amenity, aesthetic beauty, or the long-term public welfare.
The result was the creation of vast, soul-crushing wildernesses of mean streets. In the sprawling outer rings of London and the massive northern industrial centers, developers built endless, monotonous rows of cheap brick terrace housing.
There were no parks integrated into the designs, no public squares, no open green spaces within reach of the working-class children. When the school bell rang, the only available playground for these children was the hard, filthy, dangerous street itself.
These newly fabricated urban sprawls were too massive, too hastily built, and too uniform to possess any individual unity or civic character. They could not be comprehended or loved by the eye in the way that the organic, historically layered streets of ancient Athens, Rome, or even Tudor London had been loved by their inhabitants.
For millions of these urban citizens, the psychological divorce from the rhythms and beauties of the natural world, which we identified earlier as the great tragedy of the agricultural collapse, was now absolute and permanent.
And tragically, they were equally divorced from any architectural dignity or aesthetic significance in the wilderness of the mean streets where they were born, raised, and died. The physical reality of urban and suburban life in late Victorian England made absolutely no appeal to the human imagination.
The concept of civic pride had been entirely hollowed out. It was measured purely in terms of material output and population density, devoid of any aesthetic aspiration.
You had visionary artists and socialists like William Morris screaming into the void about this. As early as 1868, Morris was looking at the hideous, unregulated sprawl of the towns and writing desperate poetry, dreaming of a London that was small, white, and clean, with a crystal-clear Thames bordered by lush green gardens.
But the momentum of industrial capitalism was unstoppable. There was no going back to a pastoral ideal. The pervasive, choking pall of coal smoke and greasy soot that hung over every major city was, in itself, enough to suffocate any localized effort to inject beauty into the architecture.
And it is into this deeply compromised, aesthetically barren physical environment of the slum and the endless suburban sprawl that the state finally decides to inject the incredibly potent force of universal education.
The year 1870 marks the definitive turning point. Gladstone's government passes the Education Bill of 1870, largely driven by W. E. Forster. This legislation doubled the financial grants provided by the state to the existing network of church schools and Roman Catholic schools, while simultaneously establishing a massive new network of secular board schools, which were funded directly by local taxpayers.
The historical analysis is very clear that this dual system was a messy, highly contentious religious compromise. The secularists hated funding the church, and the church hated the secular boards.
But regardless of the friction, it finally provided England with the administrative machinery necessary to achieve universal primary education, a step that was absolutely vital if the nation hoped to avoid falling permanently behind its better educated rivals like Germany.
The results were immediate and staggering. Between 1870 and 1890, the average daily attendance in English schools exploded from roughly 1.25 million children to 4.5 million.
This foundational system was subsequently refined and expanded by Balfour's Education Act of 1902. Balfour's legislation abolished the highly localized, often inefficient school boards and transferred the authority to larger, better-funded county councils.
Crucially, this act finally began to construct a viable, state-sponsored ladder that allowed the most gifted working-class children to progress from primary schools into secondary education and eventually to the universities.
The text asserts with absolute certainty that without the intervention of these two massive education acts, the rapidly swelling populations of these unplanned cities would have inevitably sunk into the barbarism of total uneducated ignorance.
This legislation successfully manufactured a literate populace. It formally replaced the ancient rural system of apprenticeship, where a youth's mind and character were slowly formed by the practical influences of agricultural work and nature with formal classroom instruction.
But this brings us to what is, without a doubt, Trevelyan's sharpest, most cynical, and most devastatingly relevant critique in the entire analysis. The state successfully built this massive machinery of popular education, but the ultimate result was, in several profound respects, a catastrophic disappointment.
Trevelyan observes that the system successfully produced a vast, sprawling population that possessed the mechanical ability to read, but utterly lacked the critical capacity to distinguish what was actually worth reading.
It is an incredibly dark, penetrating insight into the limits of basic literacy. The state education system functioned like a factory, churning out millions of half-educated and quarter-educated citizens.
They possessed the technical skill to decipher printed text, but they had not been subjected to the rigorous intellectual training required to analyze arguments, weigh evidence, or appreciate the deeper nuances of complex literature.
Consequently, this newly minted reading public became incredibly easy, highly lucrative prey for purveyors of cheap sensations, emotional manipulation, and lowest common denominator appeals.
The analysis explicitly states that this newly literate mass did not become the patrons of great literature or serious investigative journalism. Instead, they became the eager consumers of the new journalism, a sensationalist, profit-driven media apparatus that actively debased the quality of both literature and public discourse.
The text looks at the trajectory of this cheap media machine and openly, anxiously wonders whether, in the 20th or 21st centuries, the relentless flood of the lower, sensational forms of literature and journalism will eventually rise up and completely devour the higher, intellectual forms.
The only bulwark against that dark outcome, the author argues, is the hope that an improved system of secondary and higher education will eventually manage to cultivate a sufficiently large, intellectually robust demographic that will continue to demand and financially support literature and journalism that is genuinely devoted to truth and complexity.
It's a very familiar, almost chilling paradox for us today. You look at the 21st century, we handed the entire global population the internet. We granted everyone instantaneous access to the entirety of human knowledge. But because we failed to simultaneously instill the rigorous filters of critical thinking and media literacy, we accidentally turbocharged a machine that generates endless sensationalism, misinformation, and tribal outrage.
The Victorians were staring down the exact same barrel in 1870 when they mandated universal literacy. They built the audience, but they couldn't control what the audience chose to consume.
If we synthesize all these disparate threads into the broader historical picture, it perfectly encapsulates the exhausting, relentlessly transformative journey of the late Victorian era. We are looking at a generation that completely rewrote the rules of its own society.
They democratized their voting franchise, instituted a meritocracy in their government, and threw open the doors of their ancient universities.
They stoically endured the total economic collapse of their rural heartland and the permanent severance of their psychological connection to nature. They constructed massive, sprawling, aesthetically bankrupt cities.
They endured an agonizing intellectual crisis, losing their unquestioning theological faith while desperately clinging to their rigid moral frameworks.
They birthed a massive, impersonal corporate structure and subsequently fought bitter, protracted legal wars to secure rights for organized labor. And finally, they mandated the education of their impoverished masses, unleashing the unpredictable, chaotic force of mass media upon their politics.
It is a breathtaking amount of systemic change to cram into a single lifetime.
But as we reach the conclusion of this deep dive, there is one final, incredibly ominous shadow looming over all of this hard-won prosperity, all of this democratic reform, and all of this intellectual debate. Because this entire magnificent edifice of Victorian civilization, with all of its grosser materialistic flaws and all of its higher intellectual achievements, was entirely predicated on one unique, massively fragile geopolitical advantage.
Their absolute immunity from the devastation of great land wars.
Yes. For a century, the English citizenry had lived safely behind the impregnable wooden and later iron shield of the Royal Navy. This unparalleled geographic and military security allowed Englishmen to conceptualize all the complex problems of life, politics, and economics purely in terms of uninterrupted peace and guaranteed security.
The tragic flaw in their worldview was that they actually came to believe this exceptional safety was a permanent, universal order of nature, rather than the incredibly fortunate outcome of temporary, highly localized historical circumstances.
The historical analysis bluntly asserts that no great nation in history, with the possible exception of their English-speaking cousins in the geographically isolated United States, has ever been so utterly, thoroughly civilian in its daily thought, its political practice, and its strategic outlook as late Victorian England.
They genuinely believed that the violent, shifting politics of the European continent were merely a matter of distasteful diplomatic maneuvering, not a question of their own literal existence. They viewed themselves strictly as islanders, commanding an overseas empire of trade, not as vulnerable continentals sharing borders with hostile armies.
They were sailors and merchants, not soldiers. They spent the better part of a century painstakingly constructing a delicate, highly optimized society that could only function within the insulated, peaceful vacuum provided by their geographic moat.
But as the 19th century bleeds into the 20th, as Queen Victoria finally dies and the long era bearing her name concludes, a tremendous, unprecedented revolution in human affairs is quietly gathering momentum in the workshops of inventors.
The text introduces the ultimate agent of their geopolitical ruin, the perfection of the internal combustion engine.
The technology that changes the physics of the world. The motor car, the motor lorry, the submarine, the armored tank, and ultimately the airplane.
Trevelyan describes the consequences of these new technologies with a terrifyingly accurate phrase. He says they were space annihilating.
On a domestic level, the motor car would soon transform the remnants of rural England into one massive, interconnected, unplanned suburb, forcing the society to adjust its habits of thought to new, accelerated conditions with unexampled speed.
But far more existentially, the invention of the submarine beneath the waves and the airplane above the clouds meant that the surface of the sea could no longer be exclusively held by the guns of the Royal Navy.
The English Channel could no longer protect them from the continent. The text concludes by stating that these specific inventions violently violated the thousand-year-old sanctities of the peaceful island.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of the era. The very technological progress that the Victorians worshipped so fiercely, the scientific method they had elevated to replace their ancient religious dogmas, was exactly what erased their impenetrable safety forever.
Their happy-go-lucky, dangerously civilian attitude towards the massive accumulation of military power on the European continent, and their stubborn refusal to adequately arm their populace to meet these terrifying new three-dimensional realities, was about to mutate from a philosophical blind spot into an acute existential danger.
The historian writing this analysis concludes with a somber note, admitting that what will happen to England in the impending mechanized wars of the new century is a dark mystery, no better known to him than to anyone else.
It is a deeply chilling cliffhanger to end an era on. A society walking blindly into the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the silent tides and legislative avalanches of the late Victorian world, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. The Victorians spent half a century completely unaware that the internal combustion engine and the concept of heavier than air flight were quietly gestating in the background. Technologies that would instantly evaporate the geographic moat that allowed their entire political and social reality to exist. As you look around at the dizzying, rapid technological shifts happening in our own era, the silent tides making in by 100 creeks and inlets in your own daily life, what invisible moat protecting your current way of life, your career, or your sense of security is quietly evaporating right now without you even noticing.